WA have had quite a hot summer. So even if you're not looking at confinement feeding your ewes, might be helping with getting those weaners up to weights and things, seeing that the prices are going up. Just a bit of a quick update on our confinement PDS. So we've just finished our first year of our PDS. Our host farmer Tom had a great season. I think Wickerpen was really lucky that we got a really good early break, which created a lot of biomass. So he's had a really good season. The flock that he put into confinement were put over a merino ram, where the ones that weren't in confinement were put over a white Suffolk. So our lambing isn't a pair and pair sort of thing. So we're just going through the data to see if we can make it more comparable. But he's looking at putting all his ewes in this year, which sort of goes to show that it's still a really effective management strategy. He also was able to spend the same amount of time managing 2,000 ewes that weren't in confinement compared to 4,000 ewes that were in confinement. So he found a lot of labour efficiencies there. And he also had less ewe deaths in his confinement feeding flock. So we had some really good results. I think, going into this year, we're hoping to have 3 host farmers to get a bit of data backing to see what sort of outcomes can really be achieved. But I'm hoping Susan can also give us some good insight, because I know she's been doing a lot of work in this space. So I'll hand over to Susan. Susan's from Charles Sturt University, and she's done some great work in confinement feeding and sheep in general. So I'll leave it with you, Susan.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm hoping that today we can, I'm going to squash quite a lot into this little presentation, but hopefully we can answer some of the questions that you might have. So might go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the key thing about containment is that it's different from grazing, as you'd be no doubt aware, and that's why we really get into issues. So feeding issues are the most important risk with containment feeding. Now, Caitlin asked me to talk particularly about late gestation ewes, because in this season that people might be having ewes in later than normal. And so it's really important to note that the way you manage the ewes at different stages of gestation actually does differ a bit. Now, you'd no doubt be aware that the nutritional needs vary considerably from a dry ewe or a non-pregnant ewe through to late pregnancy and lambing. So in this table here, I've got the energy requirements, so metabolizable energy requirements of a 70 kilo ewe, so 70 kilo standard reference rate. So that means in dry condition and in condition score 3. So when they're, dry or early pregnant, both singles and twins will have an ME requirement per day of 9.4. By the time we get up to the start of late pregnancy, so 6 weeks pre-lambing at day 110, the singles will have an ME requirement of 12.9, but the twins will have 15.4. And by the time we get up to the point of lambing, those have increased substantially. So it's critical that the ewes getting sufficient energy for the particular stage of pregnancy that she's at, because if she's not particularly in late pregnancy, you're going to risk getting pregnancy toxemia. So maintaining energy requirement is critical. But don't forget about your protein requirements. So they do also change with advancing pregnancy. So in a dry or early pregnant ewe, that's only 7%. But late pregnancy and during lambing, it's a minimum of 12%. Okay, and be aware that many of your feed supplements are probably not going to have that protein requirement. Okay, so you might need to add something with a higher protein than what you are actually feeding. Be aware though that the roughage requirements also increase. So in the dry ewe, early pregnant ewe, our minimum roughage requirement, so hay, straw, whatever, is 10%. By not feeding that quantity, you would be risking acidosis. because I know there's some recommendations around that you can feed without roughage, but that was a really quite risky thing to be doing. By the time we get up to lambing, we really do need to increase the roughage component because that will assist in our lactation performance. So if you don't have enough roughage during lambing, basically they're not going to lactate properly, and that will obviously impact on your lamb growth rates. The other thing to be aware of is that the space allowance also changes between pregnancy and lactating. So the standards and guidelines requirement, animal welfare requirement, is actually 1.4 meters squared per ewe up to the point of lambing, and when they're lambing it's 1.8. Not that most people would be running ewes in containment at those rates, but those are the minimum requirements. Next slide, please. So a couple of things you do need to think about. So late pregnant ewes, as you're no doubt aware, do have a higher risk from nutritional issues. So if you put them off their feed for a day or two during late pregnancy, you know, as I said, that's likely to risk them getting pregnancy toxemia. Okay, it's not going to happen during early and mid pregnancy, but certainly during the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, particularly the last 2 to 4, it is a much higher risk. Regardless of the stage of pregnancy or lactation, ideally we'd be getting a feed test on our feed supplements just to make sure that we're feeding them to requirement, because there is a lot of variation within feeds, you know, around the average. But the feed test is not enough. We really need to monitor the ewe condition while they're in containment as well, because your feed test is still only an estimate, and there's all sorts of issues with, you know, some ewes not eating as much as others, or something else going wrong that, you know, they don't perform quite as you might expect from a feed test. Okay, so you do need to monitor ewe condition regularly to make sure that the feed is actually up to requirement. We don't want to waste feed though, so do monitor your feed wastage if there is any, and also the weather conditions, because if it becomes cold, certainly the requirement will actually increase to keep warm, and so, you know, in those circumstances you might need to feed actually more than what had been adequate in the past. Really is highly recommended to preg scan ewes, certainly for fetal number, not just dry and wet, but for fetal number, so that you can reduce your feed requirements if you feed them in different pens. Particularly in late pregnancy and lactation, the difference in ME requirement is quite considerable. So there can be quite substantial savings by actually doing so. The reason I say potentially consider scanning for fetal age is that you can, if you've got a 6-week spread in your lambing or your age of gestation, you know, you can still make savings by putting them into, you know, early and late lambing groups, for example, because I said the, you know, the ME requirements do increase quite substantially in late pregnancy, and so you don't need to feed some of them that much early on. It's only going to be an advantage though if you're going to put them in separate pens. If you don't put them in separate pens, it's not probably not that cost effective. Really important to have ewes in score 2, condition score 2 plus. We don't want any ewes in a less than a score 2. They're higher risk, particularly as they get towards late gestation and lambing, you know, of increased mortality and, you know, things going wrong. So for good welfare, keep them between a 2 and about a 3.5. Our target, as you'd be no doubt aware, is a score 3 at joining and at lambing. We don't want them to be fat, like score 4, because that's going to risk, particularly in late pregnancy, pregnancy toxemia, but also it's a heavier weight, and you're feeding more than you really need to keep the ewe healthy. So it's not efficient to have ewes in score 4. Next slide, please. So one of the things Caitlin asked me to particularly talk about, because you were interested in, is acclimatizing ewes into containment. And this is a really important thing. So the thing to understand is what are the risks, and the key risks with containment is acidosis, so grain poisoning, shy feeders, and the risk, as I said before, are always increased in late pregnant ewes, because if you put them off their feed, you're going to risk preg tox. So how do we avoid or minimize the risk of issues? Really important that we have prior exposure to whatever feed type you're feeding. So ideally, you guys would be doing imprint feeding of weaners, so feeding them when those lambs are still with the ewes, just a couple of times with whatever feed you're going to feed them later, so they know what the feed type is. So if the ewe teaches the lamb to eat the feed, that lamb will remember it for a couple of years. Sheep aren't stupid. And it will reduce by about 3 weeks the time it actually takes to get sheep onto the feed when you actually do need to feed them. So prior exposure to whatever type of feed you have is a good way to minimize the risk when you actually do need to put them in containment. Absolutely critical that you introduce your grain or pellets slowly, okay? And that takes time. And then the amount of time that takes will depend on how much you're going to have to feed them, which will depend somewhat on what stage of pregnancy they're at. Okay, so while if you're in early pregnancy, you might be only feeding them, 500-700 grams a day. That will take a week, maybe a little bit more to get them onto that. But by the time you get up to late pregnancy, you're feeding a lot more. It takes a lot more time to get them up to that quantity of grain. And particularly if you're going to be feeding every second or third day, not daily during late pregnancy, it takes maybe 3 weeks to get them up to that quantity of grain. So you need to allow time before you actually put them in containment to try and avoid trying to introduce grain during late pregnancy. So that would be a risky thing to do. Whenever we put them in, we still need to monitor their manure and their behaviour to assess whether they've got some mild or even severe acidosis. Obviously, that's a daily thing when we're introducing grain, because this can cost you quite a lot of or mortality and less efficiency and therefore money if we don't deal with an acidosis problem early on. So obviously if we get acidosis, we need to back off on our grain and increase our roughage component. But it's something that does require careful monitoring, because this is your biggest risk in containment feeding. The other thing that does occur when we're introducing particularly is shy feeders. So shy feeders are sheep that either don't come up to the feed trough and eat, or they don't eat as much as they should, and therefore they're going to be losing weight. And so it's critical that we actually identify them in the first week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, particularly, and take them out and put them in a separate pen and manage them separately, or put them back in the paddock and feed them out in the paddock. Some sheep just don't adapt well to pen feeding. We do need to keep an eye on them constantly, though, the duration they're in. After the first 2 to 3 weeks, there shouldn't be too many issues with shy feeders, but you just need to keep an eye on it. One of the things that's critical in ensuring that the number of shy feeders is minimised, but also that all sheep have the opportunity to get their grain, is to ensure that the trail length or the trough feeding system is sufficiently long so that all of them can access it at once. So unlike when you're doing lamb feedlotting, where you're feeding an ad lib ration, with containment feeding, we're only feeding from maintenance, so they can eat it fairly rapidly, and that means that the piggy ones get in first and eat it all, and the shy feeders don't get access to it. So sufficient trough length means that everyone can come up to the trough and get in at the same time, and there'll be less problems. Now, there's not a lot of scientific information on whether you should feed, big ones heavy ones or different ages, etc., separately. But there is some evidence that suggests that you should separate breeds. So first cross ewes and merinos, for example, when they're in containment, because some breeds are a bit pushier than others. One thing we do recommend is that we feed straw rather than hay to reduce the number of shy feeders. But just be aware that during late pregnancy, there's intake limits on how much the sheep can actually eat. And so the quality of the diet becomes much more important or quality of roughage becomes more important in late pregnancy. In late pregnant ewes, we would recommend hay rather than straw. But certainly in early pregnancy, mid-pregnancy, straw is a cheaper option. Next slide, please. So the other thing that Caitlin wanted me to talk about was acclimatizing ewes out of containment, and this again is another period when you think you've got it all done and you're safe, and you let them out, and sometimes things go wrong. So what can occur is that when we let them out, we have acidosis or pulpy kidney. We can also have big issues with preg tox or calcium deficiency or magnesium deficiency. Okay. The other thing that can occur is that we can get reduced staple strength. So those are the risks. So how do we try to avoid those risks? So pulpy kidney in particular, we can prevent by having an adequate vaccination program. So both before entry to the containment, but also ideally a couple of weeks before they're released from containment, because pulpy kidney is associated with a big change in diet. Before we release them from containment, ideally we should feed them so they don't go out hungry and get a gut full of rich green grass or something else. Okay, so feeding them on the day you let them out, whether that's with grain or with hay, either will do, but ideally don't let them out hungry. Something that does happen is that, you all get sick of feeding and it costs you a lot of money, and then we let them out of containment before there's actually adequate pasture. And so what happens then is that the sheep will run around chasing green feed, but they're not actually eating sufficient to maintain themselves. And particularly when that's happening with late pregnant ewes, because we don't want to lamb in containment if we can help it. They're late pregnant. They're not getting enough nutrition, and then they're going to run the risk of getting preg tox. So don't let them out too early, because it might be green, but there may not be enough pasture out there. It's high water content as well, usually. So just don't jump the gun on that. When we do let them out, again, what we're trying to do is trying to avoid is a sudden change in diet. And so ideally we might continue to supplement for maybe a week after they're released. And if the pasture is not sufficient to give them the full diet, we might need to continue supplementing for a longer period of time. So again, it's about monitoring both the pasture and the ewes to make sure that their nutrition is going to be adequate. Something that some people have tried is to gradually release sheep out of containment. So let them out for a bit of a feed and then put them back in. And so do that over, say a week. So it can work, but it can be quite difficult to get them back in to containment once you've got them out. They don't really enjoy being in containment. So that's something to consider. One of the other risks, as I said, is calcium and magnesium deficiency after release. So ideally, yes, with late pregnant ewes, we should continue our calcium magnesium supplements out in the paddock. And that would be particularly the case when we've got a lot of lush grass pasture that we've put them on with a low legume content, because that will be a risk. So the other risk was reduced stable strength. So reduced stable strength can occur because we've got a sudden change in nutrition. It would also occur if we've got a sudden somewhat reduction in nutrition because the sheep are chasing not enough green feed. And then we get a big increase in wool growth when the pasture, does take off. Maintaining staple strength is about maintaining the fiber diameter or wool growth as uniform as possible. So obviously that's not entirely easily done, but minimizing the changes in nutrition will improve staple strength. The other thing that we can do is to consider, do we need to shear? So that would depend very much on, whatever your normal time of shearing is. Some people like to shear before they go into containment, but obviously, you have to work that out depending on how much wool they've got at the time. And, so whether you want to shear them soon after they go out of containment, it will depend on when they were shorn. But it's important to note that if you've got, longish wool, or even, sort of 6 months growth wool, once you let them out of containment, you're likely to get a large change in wool growth, which is likely to prompt a reduction in staple strength. So anything that you do to minimize the change in nutrition once they go out, make it a gradual change, not a sudden change, and certainly avoid reductions in nutrition will improve your staple strength. Next slide, please. So keeping sheep healthy in containment is really about prevention. We want to avoid all these issues, not have to deal with them. So your risks, as I said before, the key one is acidosis, but certainly pulpy kidney, which is due to either high grain diets or sudden change in diet. But pregnancy toxemia and calcium and magnesium deficiency are all metabolic things which are quite common. And worms is the other thing to really take note of. So how do we avoid all these things? Certainly avoiding acidosis is a slow introduction to grain. And don't forget that when you're changing batches of the same type of grain, so you run out of grain, you have to buy in a new batch, even if it's the same type of grain, change it over several feeds. So change it, over 3 feeds during a week. Don't run out of one feed and then introduce just the entire new batch of feed, because that can cause grain poisoning. Whenever we are feeding a high grain diet, whether that's in the paddock or in containment, we should be adding 1% salt plus 1% limestone, because cereals are deficient in both salt and calcium. When we get into late pregnancy and during lambing, we should be also adding a magnesium supplement, and so we can add 1% Cosmag at that time. So this can be either sprinkled onto your grain as it goes into your feed cart, or you can provide a lick out a loose lick out or a block lick out in the paddock, or in fact sprinkle it on your hay if you're feeding hay and a grain ration separately. Ideally, it is sprinkled onto your grain because the problem with loose licks out in your pen is that not all sheep might eat the loose lick, whereas everyone will be eating grain and therefore be getting their mineral supplement. Just be aware that sometimes vitamin A can be a problem, or lack of vitamin A can be a problem, because again, that's deficient in cereals. So if you've gone for 3 months or more where they've had no green feed at all, and no green hay or maize or corn, because they've got vitamin A in them, you may need to be providing a vitamin A supplement, and so that can be done with an injection or supplements. So perhaps talk to your vet if you think that might be becoming an issue. Certainly, before we put them in containment, we should be vaccinating against clostridials. So, ideally a 5 or 6 in one, and ideally 2 to 4 weeks prior to entry, but also exit. And that may or may not coincide with your annual pre-lambing vaccination of a 5 or 6 in one as well. But it's a cheap insurance basically, and losses can be quite significant if you happen to have an outbreak of one of your clostridial diseases. So in terms of worm management, probably drench before entry. You might want to do a worm egg count, determine do you need to drench before they go in, and then monitor worm egg counts while they're in containment, just so that you're not feeding worms rather than sheep, or as well as sheep. Lot of discussion about how do you feed sheep. So ideally we would feed them off the ground, so either in troughs or belting. Troughs are expensive, but there's all sort, whatever sort of troughing type system. So rubber matting, galvanized iron, guttering, anything that you can put feed in or grain in a trail is really an adequate means of feeding them. Just because it keeps the feed clean, it reduces wastage, and it reduces the chance of them picking up, several diseases, including worm eggs, if you were feeding on the ground. I'm guessing that, a lot of people do feed on the ground, and certainly that is the cheapest way to do this. Feeding on the ground works quite well when you've got hard ground. It doesn't work quite so well when you've got sand, or once it rains and it gets muddy, and therefore we get get a lot more wastage. But you have to work out what suits you for whatever number of sheep you've got and whatever time of year and facilities you've got. Don't forget, you need clean water. So clean troughs and water, because both the means by which they can pick up toxins or diseases. When it's hot, sheep will drink 10 litres of water a day. So that actually needs, a reasonable water delivery system. Dams are okay, but dams do run out of water and sheep get stuck in them. And also be aware that if your dam is in your containment facility, when it rains, manure washes into it, and so that can become, toxic as well. So just be aware of that. Ideally, we've got shade and shelter in our containment. So once it gets more than 25 degrees Celsius, sheep start to feel hot. And particularly when they're off shears and they don't have the protection of wool to insulate them. So provision of shade is really a welfare requirement. Trees are fine. You may need to fence your trees off to stop them being ring-barked, but some form of shade is really desirable, if they're in containment over, summer and early autumn. As I said before, monitoring condition score throughout the time they're in containment is really important, because, if they're pregnant, their energy requirement does change, and whilst they might be fine with what you're feeding when they're in early pregnancy, you've got to make sure that they're still fine when they're in late pregnancy. And the key thing to remember is that if you think there's something wrong, call your local vet in, okay? Deal with it before it becomes a big problem, because big problems tend to cost you money. So if you don't know what it is, get some professional advice. Next slide, please. The other thing that Caitlin asked me to talk about was how do we make it more efficient and reduce our economic input, because feeding sheep in containment is really quite expensive. So what are our biggest costs? Facilities are certainly one of our biggest costs, but the thing to remember is that if you haven't already got one, simple systems work. So we don't need well, we probably shouldn't be processing grains, for example, for sheep, because that will increase the risk of acidosis. We might do that for cattle, but certainly not for sheep. We don't have to have a feed mixer. So people, feed trails of grain on the ground, put, a bale of hay in the pen, and those types of feeding systems do work. So it doesn't have to be, a really, expensive thing with lots of money invested in it. As I said, trail feeding is the cheapest form of feeding, but as I said, do be careful when you've got sand or high mud, which will increase wastage. There's not good comparisons between use of self-feeders and trail feeding. When we're maintenance feeding, self-feeders can tend to increase the number of shy feeders. So the pushy ones get in and eat their fill, and the less pushy ones sort of miss out. And so if you were using self-feeders, monitoring becomes really important. But the other issue with self-feeders is that, they're quite expensive. Certainly they reduce wastage of feed, but they're limited in for a maintenance diet, they're limited in how many sheep they can sort of feed. So you need a lot of them to feed a lot of sheep, which becomes very expensive. And so, as I said, trail feeding is a cheaper option. Do be very careful with what you're feeding them. Feed is our biggest cost. And what we should be doing is working out our lowest cents per megajoule of energy to feed, whilst ensuring that we've got adequate protein and roughage in the diet. So there's a lot of variation in the energy cost for different feeds. Grains tend to be cheaper than hays, but we really need to work it out. Now, I have put some documents at the end of the slides, and if you go and look into any departmental drought feeding manual, they've probably got a table there which has actually worked it out, cents per megajoule of energy for different types of feeds with different energy densities. So energy densities of the feed. So you don't actually have to work it out, but do be aware of it and do work it out on that basis. Understanding also that, there are limitations in what facilities you've got, for silos or hay storage or whatever. You've got to work within what you can manage and what gear you've got to feed out. But just because it's the lowest price per dollars tonne does not mean it's the lowest price for feeding your sheep. So do a feed budget. The other big cost is labour, particularly for feeding them for a long time. Now, one of the ways we can reduce our labour is by feeding, rather than daily feeding, we can feed every second day or 2 or 3 times weekly, and that will substantially reduce our labour requirements. Just be aware, though, that we should be feeding daily during late pregnancy and lambing, so the last 4 to 6 weeks and during lambing, just for the welfare of the ewes. The other thing that you really need to think about is the risk of loss of production. So if, the mortality rate in containment should be very low. It really should, and most people report less than 1%. Ideally, we're not getting diseases in there, which again are going to cost us a lot of money potentially. But also be aware that ewes that are in too low a condition will be losing production through not getting pregnant, or through lower lamb survival once they get out the other end. So loss of production is certainly something you should be considering as well. I think that was my last slide. There might be another slide.
There is one more slide with a few resources on it.
Yeah. So I have listed some here, but there's certainly, I didn't actually look at the Western Australian government drought feeding manual, but I'm sure they've got one. The Victorian one I know is quite good, and it certainly has a lot of useful information in it, although some of the information in there is not actually, it's anecdotal, and we haven't actually got the science to back up some of the recommendations, but that's what's there. The one that I've written is managing breeding using containment areas, which is on the MLA website, which is much briefer, but it specifically covers some of this repro stuff that I've talked about. So there's certainly more detailed information around, and I'd thoroughly recommend you go and grab one of those manuals to help you manage your use. So yeah, if there was any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I
got one, Susan.
Yep.
When you said about don't feed processed feeds for sheep, did you mean like cracked or rolled grain, or what were you talking about there?
Yeah, cracking, rolling grain is what I mean. Yeah. So you certainly do that for cattle.
Yeah, right.
It improves the efficiency of use, but for sheep, that will just lead to digestive problems, and acidosis.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So feed whole grains, even with lupins. Yeah.
Yeah, lupins are fine, but I sort of find that half the excrement's full of barley or wheat. Is there any recommendations for minimising the straight through of grain?
Yeah, no. Well, what my understanding is that even though there's whole grain still there, it has still been digested.
Okay.
And I mean, I'll reinforce the point. If you crack it, etc., one, it's an extra cost, but it will cause digestive upsets. Okay, so you don't want to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me here, Susan?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. Sorry, just not sure what the system in this computer is. You mentioned about the 5-in-1 vaccinations, either one a bit before they go in and a bit before they come out. Our system will probably be the use in until probably a couple of weeks before lambing, but I'm not sure that I can quite spin it, convince my boss for 2 vaccinations. So is there like a more important one if you're just going to be doing this sort of the 1 vaccination around confinement feeding? Sorry, pretty broad question.
Yeah, well, it sort of depends on the timing, depends on how long they're in there for.
Probably would only be in for maybe 5 weeks.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I would vaccinate before they go in.
Yeah.
To avoid that sudden, getting when you get that sudden change of feed, because that will still, if they're only in there for 5 weeks, it will still cover the, the period is still going to give protection to the fetus, after birth.
Fair enough.
Because
I think for us it would be they'd be going in off just almost bare ground, probably not before the break of the season, and they would have been trail fed lupins and maybe some barley, and then that's what they're going to get fed in there as well. So probably depending on the season, you never know what the season's going to do, but probably the biggest feed change will be coming out onto green feed, and they'll have ad lib hay or straw depending on time of pregnancy when they're in there.
Yeah, no, the pre-entry vaccination is the more critical one in that case, because if they're only in there for 5 weeks or so, while the recommendation for vaccinating pre-lambing is 4 to 6 weeks, there's actually quite a longer period when it will still be effective. So yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions? I do have a few, Susan. So at the start you were talking about, I guess, rationing really good protein, but also really good roughage. And in that late pregnancy, I guess, is there any recommendations on how to balance that roughage so they're not filling up with roughage and not getting enough protein, I guess?
Well, it depends on what you're feeding them. What two things are you feeding them? So you'd normally not be feeding sufficient roughage for them to fill up on in late pregnancy, and they'll have to eat grain to get enough energy, because roughage is an expensive supplement typically per unit of ME. So you're only going to be feeding 20, maybe 30% roughage typically.
Yeah.
And the reason why you don't feed, you're probably not going to feed, an entirely roughage ration, and you could, but is that the energy density of roughages tends to be lower than for grain. And particularly when you're getting, twin bearing ewes, they're really going to struggle just to eat enough, just of that roughage to actually meet their energy requirement. Yeah.
Thank you. Also, with the acidosis, I guess, you said that to look out for changes like stools and things like that. What sort of, I guess, indicators are there for like the early signs of acidosis?
Yep.
Yeah.
So certainly look at the behavior of sheep. So if it's not coming up to the trough, if it's standing and looking slightly unhappy, particularly tucked up, scouring in the worst case. But yeah, it's just not interested in feed. When you're only feeding maintenance, they should run to the trough. Okay.
Yeah.
So if it's standing up the back for some reason, it needs to be looked at. It might be a shy feeder, but it might be acidosis. So reluctant to move, and lame in worst cases. A little bit sore in the feet, to very sore in the feet. In the worst cases, they will go down on the ground and can't get up. Okay, but they will become very lame in the worst cases. When they unable to get up off the ground, that's probably the stage when you need to probably be putting them down. Okay, because they're not going to recover. Okay, but if they can walk, they will probably recover. So in terms of manure, so we're feeding a dry ration, so the manure should be firm, pellets. And so it ranges from pellets to soup, basically liquid soup. So if you've got liquid soup, you've got a major problem. But there's graduation between that and the pellets. So if it's if you can't see pellets, there's some degree of acidosis on those types of diets. Yeah.
Thank you.
But the severity of it, certainly look at the behavior. But the manure on the ground is a good indication of whether you might have a problem. And you can smell it. It smells different.
Yeah.
Not sure whether there's a question there or it's just an issue with the...
Not I can see. So, just like to thank Susan for coming along. For you guys that are attending, this recording will be available. So if you need to go back and have a look at a few slides, it will be there. If you do have any questions or you're not sure about anything, or, Susan talked about feed tests and things, if you need a hand finding someone to help you out, don't hesitate to give me a call or an email, or anyone at the Facey group would be able to give you a hand. Even on the vet side of things, some of my host farmers have really good relationships with DPIRD, and they'll come out and look at one ewe if it sort of thing. So don't hesitate to get help, I guess. We also have a few events coming up that I just want to give you, I guess, first insights too, because they haven't been advertised quite yet. So we've got our trials night coming up on the 7th of March, which has a really good lineup of speakers. So Ribo will be there with a senior economist, and he'll be able to give us an update of what he thinks the land market might do this year, seeing how it performed last year. We'll also have Hayley Norman there talking about her Saltbush and Novel Understory project, which is looking at turning low productive landscapes into high productive livestock systems. And that project's looking really good. We also have a bit of a summer tour coming up, going to look at a few drought tolerant farms and projects. So we'll be off to Hayley Norman's to have a look at her saltbush. We'll also be visiting one of our confinement feeding host farmers in Williams, and we'll have a few other things on the list. So make sure you keep an eye out for those. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call. I'll try to point you in the right direction. But yes, thank you so much, Susan, for spending the morning with us and giving us some information. It's been really helpful.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. I'll let everyone get on with the rest of the day. Thanks for coming.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.